Hey everybody, it's Kyle here, and I'm very excited to do something a little bit different on this channel. Obviously, I talk about Star Wars books a lot on here, but this is the first time I've actually got to talk to the actual author of a Star Wars book. So I'm joined by Carmelo, who's actually been on this channel before as part of a group with we did, I believe, on was the Bad Batch. I can't remember
Path.
which one we did on your channel, which one we did on mine.
We did seasons. Oh, I think we did Path of Deceit with you.
Path of Deceit, yeah, but we did a High Republic
Yeah,
book on my
yeah,
channel. We did
yeah.
Bad Batch on their channel. But
Right.
Carmelo has actually written a book, which I found out about during one of those discussions. So I got it after that. I really enjoyed it. So I reached out to him to see if he'd be willing to talk about the book on this channel, and he graciously agreed. So, Carmelo, why don't you formally introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your book?
Hello there. My name is Carmelo Esterrich. I am originally from Puerto Rico, and I am a professor of humanities and cultural studies at a small arts and media school here in Chicago, called Columbia College, Chicago. I've been there since '98, so it's my home. It's probably when I'm going to retire from. Um, and I I always wanted to write something about Star Wars, and I didn't really know what. And originally, I thought maybe an essay, maybe an article, but I didn't know where to publish something like that. And then I thought, why not a book? Doesn't have to be a long book. Um, but I really thought about the idea of making the book a conversation starter rather than an exhaustive analysis of Star Wars. um when I wrote the book, television was live action television was just beginning in Star Wars. And so I just knew that, with the hundreds of novels and comics and all the movies, and it was just going to be impossible to be able to cover it all. So I from the very beginning, I always thought about it as a small book that would sort of trigger all of these ideas and all of these thoughts, for people to continue the conversation, outside of the book. And so that's why the book is this big and not that big. And also because people read this size, and reading 600 pages of Star Wars, if you're a hard fan, you will, but it's a little different. It's a little
Yeah.
different.
One thing I was kind of curious about when you told me about this book and when I got it was, the title of Star Wars Multiverse. I think everybody else in pop culture now is very familiar with multiverse, be it with like Marvel probably the best example, but then obviously like last year you had Everything Everywhere All at Once, which
Right.
might be my favorite movie of all time after I saw it 3 or 4 times last year and had my
It's a
mind blown.
beautiful film.
This is such
Totally
a
agree.
beautiful movie.
It is a
I highly
beautiful
recommend if
film.
you haven't seen it, go see that. But what you're talking about in regard to multiverse with this book is very different than like what we're kind of used to seeing multiverse in a pop culture. So can you tell people what you mean by a Star Wars multiverse?
Yeah, yeah. Marvel does not copyright this word.
Yeah,
It is actually a science word. It's sort of astrophysics and the idea of multiple universes within the universe itself. I, it's not a word. It's not a word. The title is the editor's idea. It was
yeah,
not my idea. And so I really liked the word because I wanted to create a book that was an all-inclusive Star Wars. That it was not a lot of the academic work focuses on the movie, maybe a little bit of Clone Wars, but for the most part, they didn't go into fiction, they didn't go into comics, they didn't go into cosplay, they didn't go into any of that. And so I like the idea of thinking of Star Wars as a multiverse because there are many formats of looking at Star Wars, and they all have sort of their own individual characteristics. In academia, it's very, very typical to talk about transmedia Star Wars because of film, television, comics, fiction. But in my book, I also talk about things like cosplay, which is Star Wars in your body. It's a
yeah,
very different kind of way of consuming Star Wars. And so I like the idea of multiple universes of Star Wars, not necessarily in its story, but in the way that we consume it, in the way that it's presented to us. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind about my book is that I consider both what Lucasfilm creates and what fans create. When you're a Star Wars fan, you consume the movies and the television shows and the memes and the fan fiction and the fan films and the cosplay. We don't separate those things.
Yeah.
And so I thought, why don't look at Star Wars wholesale and look at all of it. So that all-inclusive Star Wars is not only film, television, books, comics, but also fan fiction, fan art, fan film. I really wanted to write about memes in the book, but there's only so much I could write about. But that is yet another way in which we consume Star Wars. And so I wanted to sort of bring all of that. So that's my multiverse. That's my multiverse. It's not narrative. It's more about the way that we consume the many universes that we use for consuming it.
And also, that's one thing I really did enjoy about your book, because one, when I was growing up, the only new Star Wars content was books, and that's how I got into. I saw the original movies, but then one of the first books I read was the Jedi Academy young adult books that really kind of got me into
I
that.
have them right there.
The first adult, like one of the first adult novels I probably ever read was probably Heir to the Empire and Truce at Bakura. So like that really got me like, oh, that stuff, and kind of got me hooked. So I always love people that do shine a light on those books and stuff like that. But then also like I've read a couple academic Star Wars books before, and I think, like you said, yours is the first one I did see highlight Star Wars fan created content, which, as you'll see behind me, obviously I have a lot of fan created art. Obviously, cosplay is a huge part. I love going to Dragon Con. I always love seeing all the amazing cosplay for people doing very accurate stuff, like seeing High Republic characters actually in person for the first time. To see, mashup characters and stuff like that. So it's always a lot of fun. Was there a certain part of fan created content that you got into first? Was it cosplay? Was it fanfic? Was there something like that? I'll say my first thing Star Wars content, fan related, I didn't even know existed. As a young kid, when I read the Jedi Academy books, like, ooh, it'd be neat to write a Star Wars book one day. So I literally wrote a short story Star Wars thing that was probably awful, and emailed it to the publisher. And the publisher like, oh, good.
Oh, wow.
You show promise as a young author. Keep working at it. It's like, maybe a 12 or 13-year-old. I didn't really know fanfic was a thing, but I basically wrote fanfic as like a 12 or 13-year-old. So what was your kind of first, I guess, entry into Star Wars? Was fanfic?
It was cosplay.
Cosplay?
I knew about fan fiction, and I had seen a couple of fan films, which I liked very much. But cosplay, that's when I started realizing fans are actually interpreting Star Wars, recreating Star Wars, transforming Star Wars. A lot of the fan films that I had seen were very much about sort of filling the gaps of stories, or sort of making it movie-like, like it's almost like it was done by Lucasfilm. But when I really got into fan films is when I would see things that Lucasfilm would never do. Like a little short, there's a wonderful little Spanish short about a couple of gay stormtroopers that are in the Death Star arguing about which planet they want to go on vacation when they have their little break. Like, that is not happening at Lucasfilm. But it was, for me, it was cosplay. When I started going to cons and I started seeing the marvelous imagination and creativity in sort of, you mentioned mashups, and you mentioned the whole idea of transforming a character or seeing a fictional character into a body, into a person that is right in front of you. Those kinds of things I found fascinating. And then I started seeing fan art and fan film and fan fiction and things like that. I haven't really gotten into fan fiction because every time I want to read something, it's so long that I just, I'm a college professor with a full-time job. There are only so many hours in the day for me. And so I haven't really gotten into that. But fan film, fan art, I collect a lot of fan art, and cosplay. Those were the things that I sort of said, there's something really interesting here. Really, really interesting here. When I teach a Star Wars class in my college, when I finished the book, the dean of the college said, so when are you teaching the class? And I'm like, what class? So I designed this class, and it's been very successful. I'm on my third semester teaching it now. But we spend 4 weeks on produced material. And so we do fan film, a week of fan film, a week of fan art, and a week of cosplay. And it's fascinating to the conversations that we have in class after looking at the films, looking at television, reading comics, reading novels, and then seeing the other side. It just sort of, it gives you, to me, it gives you a more complete notion of what Star Wars is about. Because, Lucasfilm, it is the official creator of Star Wars, but fans are creating Star Wars too. And for fans, that's equally legitimate. It's
Yeah.
equally legitimate because we're saying important things. We really are.
Yeah, and I always like you were talking about how we interpreted stuff on our own, and kind of it always reminds me of of one of my favorite directors is Kevin Smith. So I fell in love with the Clerks, and basically, they're having
Yes.
a conversation about Star Wars that probably Lucas had never thought of, interpreting that way. Is like, what about if contractors were on the Death Star and stuff like that? Now,
Yes.
Jake honestly
Yes.
is probably like a young fan. That's one of the first times I was exposed to that type of stuff. I'm like, oh, do people actually have these types of conversations? I grew up in a rural area. That's not initially a hotbed of nerd culture, and also it's again a time period where they weren't producing new movies, so
Right.
it's like Star Wars was being talked about a whole lot. So I didn't really know that was conversation that was actually happening out there, and was kind of a lot of ways the fans kept it alive for a couple of
Yeah.
decades until we got
Oh,
more
yes,
official
absolutely.
content, and
I included Clerks in the book because it is such um it is such a characteristic way in which fans think through the story of Star Wars. And I just love that. And it's really interesting because in a way, Lucasfilm now is sort of learning from the fans about thinking through stories. I think many of the storylines of The Mandalorian are very much about let's think about the consequences and the effects of what happened in the original trilogy and how that connects to the story. It's just really, really fascinating. So having somebody like Cara Dune being connected to Alderaan and sort of the connection of Alderaan and all of that, that's what fans did before The Mandalorian came out. They just talked about those things and they continue the conversation. They literally continued the conversation.
exactly, yeah. I did have a quick question about your class when you said you cover cosplay and stuff. Are the students required to do any cosplay themselves, or how
They
do
are
they cover cosplay?
they are definitely invited to bring their cosplays. And some semesters I have more cosplays than others. But we basically divide the class into, we have a conversation about cosplay as a concept. Then I bring my cosplays to class and we talk about the process of building the cosplays. And then the third part of the class, they bring examples of cosplayers that they find online. And then we have a conversation about what these different cosplayers are doing with Star Wars, are doing with the characters. So we talk about male slave Leias, and we talk about all of these sort of like really interesting mashups of stormtroopers, and it's just really, 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 really fun. And they bring those. I don't supply those. They sort of go online, find the ones that they find really interesting, and then they go from there. We do something similar with fan art as well. Somebody found somebody drew the cover of a Vogue magazine with Darth Maul in it, as sort of like a fashion model. And we had some great conversations about this, about masculinity, about sexiness, and the sexiness of being bad, and all of those kinds of things. So it was a really interesting conversation.
So one thing I did find interesting about your book, and as you referenced earlier, you're from Puerto Rico, and I think something like, for example, myself, somebody who grew up in America as like a white male. A lot of times you don't really necessarily think about like, oh, how Star Wars is being interpreted in various cultures and stuff like that. So, like, for example, you like growing up, even like before you came here, um,
Mhm.
how would you say like what are some elements of Star Wars that you view differently that maybe you know a fan like myself in America be like, oh, I never thought of that. That's a good point. That type of stuff.
I think because of my Puerto Rican background and also my sort of my Latin American connections, the whole idea of a rebellion and the idea of the empire had connections very much with sort of US intervention in Latin America, with the Cuban Revolution, with the Mexican Revolution. And so when I was looking at those rebels, I was really thinking about the Latin American revolutions. And in Puerto Rico, people who are sort of pro-independence and not interested in being part of the United States really use the language of empire to talk about the United States. They talk about the American empire. Um, and so it's really interesting that, Lucas thought about sort of the conflict between the US and Vietnam as the story of Star Wars is constructed. And my students are always shocked to sort of like, oh, wait a minute, the US is the empire and the Vietnamese are the rebels. And they always get a little double take thinking about this. But that's the way I saw it. I saw it and I thought about it when I was in Puerto Rico. The whole idea of the big empire, the all-powerful empire, and the little rebels that could, the little rebels that managed to fight against it. And so it's really, really interesting. There's a really interesting Puerto Rican podcast that talked about the Trade Federation in the prequel trilogy and how it connects to the sort of trade agreements that we have with the United States. When Hurricane Maria happened, there were all of these ships that had food and water and all of these things to deliver to Puerto Rico, but they couldn't enter because they needed to go to the United States first and get a permit to go to the island. And that's the embargo. That's the trade embargo of the Trade Federation in the prequel trilogy. And so it's really interesting how our experience, our historical experience, our cultural experience has so much to do with the way Star Wars tells the story. Language is the other thing, like who speaks English and who doesn't, who gets subtitles and who doesn't. I'm watching Star Wars with English subtitles. I'm sorry, with Spanish subtitles, because the movie's in English. We don't dub movies in Puerto Rico. We dub movies on television, but not on the big screen. And so my notion of always thinking about there's this other language that is spoken by millions of people in the United States. We are part of the United States, but we speak Spanish. We all need to learn English, just like all these characters in Star Wars need to learn basic to be able to trade and communicate. And so, a young American from Montana is not going to think about this.
I remember as a kid,
For
I always thought it was weird, like how, like I'd go like, oh, why does, like, for example, like Java get captions and subtitles? So I know it's like,
and Jawas don't.
and Jawas don't, or even like Chewie does it, or R2D2 does. It's like, I was like, why don't we get them for all and stuff? You
Right.
kind of look at it that way, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. And like I did like how your book explored that kind of like from that point of view. But even as a kid, that's something like, this doesn't make sense. Like, why does it everybody get cat, or like either like nobody should get them or everybody should get them?
Yep. I mean, that's one of my favorite chapters in the book. The whole notion about the hierarchy of life and the hierarchy of language. I love writing that book and that chapter. It was just a treat, because to me, the book basically is thinking about how Star Wars in a way reflects American culture, and how the way we live in our world in a way is sort of represented in Star Wars. I was in an interview in the Chicago Tribune, and I was just saying Star Wars is only fictionally far, far away. It's us. It's us. I always write on the board, Star Wars are us, with the backwards R of Toys R Us, because it's true. Because it's true. It is an American cultural product, and as an American cultural product, it's constantly telling us how we relate to others, how we think of politics, how we think of war, how we think of slavery, all of that.
Yes, it kind of reminds me of, and we talked about the Jedi Academy series earlier, but I remember as a kid, one of my favorite storylines was that one was when they dealt with with the character Loey, who was Chewie's nephew, who becomes involved in a group called the Diversity Alliance. And it's one of the few times in Star Wars that really dealt with that, because that's one thing, they don't really openly talk about that a lot, about like how the various species relate, and if there's any tension there and that type of stuff, and it kind of brings it up. And as a kid, that was kind of very informative, like, oh, okay, this is interesting to look at. and the
I
various
I am
times
still
that can
yeah, yeah, yeah.
evolve.
I am still beating myself up that I read that book after I wrote the book, because if I had read it before, it would have
Yeah, made it.
definitely been in the
Yeah,
book. Because when I started reading it, I'm like, oh no, 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 this is great for my book. But it is, you're right. It's really interesting that it is, it's a book for children. It's a scholastic book, I think. And so it's for a very young audience, and we're already dealing with this sort of notion of humans are the highest species and everybody else goes below that. And these are a whole bunch of disgruntled people in this galaxy saying, we got to change that.
yeah,
They do it in some sort of very authoritarian
badly.
way,
Yeah,
but it sort of presents the issue of there's a problem here.
yeah,
There's a hierarchy that is creating sort of an upper civilization and a lower civilization. So an
yeah.
advanced civilization and primitive.
That kind of led into another thing I was going to ask you later, but I'll go ahead and bring it up. Beyond the Diversity Alliance, is there maybe something at the time you were aware of? Now, you'd already kind of mentioned this in regard to Star Wars memes that you would really have liked to include it in the book, but you weren't able to, either for space reasons or you felt like maybe it didn't fit in with the overall theme, or
Yeah. The memes, the memes, I always think of the memes very much as sort of a form of fan art, because they're so many of them are satirical. And so they're a really interesting critique of what Star Wars is. And I love the idea of taking, for example, this is what memes do, taking images and then the text transforming the image. And that I found a really sort of almost politically savvy way of telling the story of Star Wars and retelling the story of Star Wars. Um, I didn't want to go into it and then not being able to sort of develop it in the book. So I very early on I sort of set it aside, because it's a different kind of media. But I've always found it fascinating because they're so astute. They are so astute. And it's really interesting how the way memes worked, I don't know, 10 years ago, are sort of turning into these, like, the TikTok videos,
yeah,
where they're sort of like, this is, a friend of mine just sent me one about all the movie titles of the Skywalker saga are wrong. And so justifying a different title for each movie. And it's brilliant. It's just absolutely brilliant. Um, and so it's really fun to see how fans interpret through memes and now through videos. Once again, in ways that Lucasfilm would not, because they did it this way, and they got to defend what they did, and that's it. But fans have the freedom of saying whatever they want,
oh, yeah.
for better or for worse. I mean, you still get issues of racism and misogyny. You still get issues of what we call toxic fandom. I'm not saying that that's not there, but there are other things that are really, really interesting, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I'll say. Obviously, maybe the biggest way I participate in Star Wars fandom is similar to you and Nick, is doing, video content, podcasts, and just talking about the stuff and interpreting and stuff like that. And you know, uh, sometimes like that's for the best. Sometimes I know, like this year, The Mandalorian, I was doing reviews. There was a few other reviewers I was enjoying, and they were putting out some theories on your mind. You think, well, this is going to happen, and when it doesn't happen, you kind of get disappointed because, like, well, that wasn't really Lucas's or the people behind it's fault.
Yeah, yeah.
Everybody came up with a theory and ran with it, and when the theory didn't turn out true, you get disappointed where they never intended that to be true. But
Right.
it's like there's positives
I,
and negatives of it and stuff, and that's, and not saying that's toxic, but it's it's I think a negative thing that now, like all big things like Marvel, Star Wars,
yep.
all that type of stuff have to deal with now, is fan theories kind of impacting how people actually interpret the content.
I think Nick and I always have this argument. He loves speculating, and I hate speculating.
Yeah.
And I hate speculating because, how do I say this?
while you interpret it, I'll tell you why.
My Say that again.
I said, let me tell you why I enjoy speculating while you think
Oh,
about
go.
it.
Please
So, like,
tell
you have
me.
the two models. Like, you have the Netflix model of like they release everything in one day, and then you have the Disney Plus model where they kind of release it like on a weekly basis. So, for example, I love the show Stranger Things. The one thing
Uh-huh.
I hate about Stranger Things is it's all released in one day. You watch it, and there's not a chance to talk with your friends and stuff like, "Oh, what do you think is going to happen in next week's episode? What did you think of it?" And you really delve deep. It's I always feel like I watch Stranger Things, and like a week after it's over, like I've completely forgot everything that happened because you watch it in one day and you don't really get to talk
Uh-huh.
about it.
Uh-huh.
Where like I love
I
the series coming out, like, oh, Mandalorian. Now we have a full week to think about it. Now there is some negative things, like again, you kind of going wild goose, and then something doesn't happen. You go like, oh, you get disappointed. But I enjoy so much that process of getting to talk with people and like really dive deep. Like, what did you think? Oh, I didn't really think of this theory. Oh, I didn't notice that. And you kind of, it's fun.
Yeah, I agree with you. I prefer weekly installments rather than dumping the whole thing. But I like it for a different reason. I like watching episodes multiple times. And when Stranger Things drops, I don't really watch them twice. I
Yeah, I
just go
don't either.
through it.
Yep.
But with The Mandalorian and with Kenobi and with Book of Boba Fett, it was really nice that I had a week to watch it again, to watch certain scenes, to think about it, to ponder about it, and all of that before going through it. I think my problem with the speculating is that it's there's this sort of notion that 90% of the time you're going to be disappointed. And it's just exhausting. It's
Yeah.
just it's just exhausting sort of spending all of that time. Well, is it going to be this? Is it going to be that? I'm like, I'm just going to wait. I'm
Yeah.
just going to wait. Um, I'm actually disappointed when on the few times that I speculate and I get it right. I sort of like, oh, well, that's not like Mandalorian season 3. I sort of expected A, B, C, D, and E, and I got A, B, C, D, and E. And I wanted to actually be
Don't be
surprised, and I
surprised.
wasn't,
Yeah.
because, oh yeah, they're gonna go to Mandalore, they're gonna do this, they're gonna do that. And so I just let the story run, and then when the story is over, maybe at least a season, then I talk the hell off.
Yeah.
But I just what's gonna happen next week? I don't know. We'll find out next week.
Yeah. I guess the way
But
I
that's just
draw the
me.
line
That's just
is
me.
like leading up to the like for the TV specifically, or even movies like this applies, is like when a trailer comes out, I'll watch the trailer, but then I stay away from the theory videos because I want to go in fresh. But it's like once, especially when the shows start, it's like, oh, we have a thing to talk about. Let's talk about that,
Mhm.
and kind of where do you think this is going and stuff like that. Because yeah, I don't get the ones who like, for example, like with a TV show or the movie, like they release a trailer 6 months in advance, and basically in your mind, by the time it comes out, they already have the movie figured out. It's like, well, what's the point of
Yeah,
going to see it at
yeah.
that point?
I usually watch the first set of trailers and then I stop.
Yeah,
Like
I'll do
when
that
Andor,
sometimes too.
I saw the first one, and then as they added more trailers, I just stopped watching. I just stopped watching because I didn't want to know more. I want to be, I want to be surprised. I want to be excited. I want to see things for the first time and all of that. And I think a lot of the problem with speculating to me is that it's very much about expectations. And when those expectations are not met, then people get really, really riled up about, but it should have been this. It's like,
Yeah,
well, no, you're not writing the story.
yeah,
um, and this is why I love fan work, because fan work is about saying, this is the way I wanted the story to be told, or this is the way I wanted this character to be this way, or to do this way, or to say that. And so I love that. To me, that's much more creative than getting angry online about the finale of Mandalorian season 3. Is not what I wanted it to do. Well, because you don't work for Lucasfilm.
yeah.
And so and even people in Lucasfilm probably are disappointed because it's not what they wanted. I find it exhausting. And so I just don't do it. I just don't do it. Some people don't drink. I don't speculate. I drink, but I don't speculate.
There you go. One thing I was kind of curious about your class. Obviously, you mentioned
Mm.
all the type of Star Wars content you kind of go over in that. Has do you feel like have any of your students came to you afterwards and like, oh, I've never watched any of the animated content, but you brought it up in class. Now I've watched Clone Wars or Rebels, and now like, oh, I'm blown away by it, or I've got into cosplay because of your class or something. Have you had reactions like that?
It's really interesting. The most difficult thing about teaching this class is that I have in the same room people that have seen every episode and every film next to somebody who's never seen anything. They're there because my dad likes Star Wars. I don't want to know why the hell he likes it. Or my roommate or my girlfriend or my boyfriend likes Star Wars and I want to know more about it. What I find really interesting, I have a student this semester, never seen anything. She took the class because she said, you know, it's part of American culture. I should know about Star Wars. And we can't watch everything in class because that's just way too much.
Yeah.
But I gave them I think about 5 episodes of season 1 of Rebels to talk about the Force in our weekly in one of the week discussions that we talked about the Force. Well, she went ahead and watched all of season 1 because she was just completely in love with the show, and she said, "No, I can't skip this one. I can't." So she just watched all of season 1. So I have lots of things like that. I have lots of things like that. There have been cases. It's really interesting. Very few students read comics. Very, very, very few. And after my first semester, now I require one of the papers is on reading a comic series. Not like 75 issues of Star Wars, but one of the trade paperbacks, 5 or 6 issues, one little unit. And it's been really interesting, sort of saying, I had a student last week told me, I'm going to read more Star Wars comics because I just love reading them. I just didn't know that this was the way you told the story of Star Wars in comics.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of that. I have a lot of that. I love the students that come with no knowledge because they ask such interesting questions. Like, I know too much. I know too much. I remember there was one time that a student came to me and said, Carmelo, in the movies, all the Sith are male. And I'm like, oh, geez, like because I've seen Asajj Ventress, because I've read Darth Bane trilogy, because I know all this stuff. It never occurred to me to think that in the Skywalker saga, the Darksiders are all male.
Yeah.
Are all male. And so it's really fun. It's really fun having people that either know very little or know nothing at all. And students are very concerned at the beginning of the semester, sort of like, am I going to pass this class? Like, how much do I need to watch in order to pass the class? And I'm like, I'll tell you what you need to watch, and we take it from there. I wish we could see more. I wish we could see more, but it's only 15 weeks. We only meet once a week. We only have 3 hours every week. There's only so much you can do, and I want them to read fiction, and I want them to read comics, and you do what you can.
I can see it be overwhelming trying to figure out what you could cover. I had a couple academic experiences kind of dealt with relate a little bit to what you've done. One, when I was in college, I took a class in my political science field related to the Vietnam War and how it's depicted in American culture. So as a part of that, like
Oh wow!
every couple of weeks, we were assigned to watch a movie and how Hollywood's depiction of Vietnam changed over a period versus like the early John Wayne movies, which were very similar to World War II, versus you get into like, Apocalypse Now and,
Right.
into more recent movies like We Were Soldiers and stuff like that. And even that, the professor said like, oh, there's like 50 movies I would love to show you, but I can only show you these. But in case you're curious, here's other ones you could explore. So again, I could kind of relate to that as far as content side, but it was a very interesting class. And it's something I hadn't really thought about that way, how it changed over a period and kind of using Hollywood to kind of explore that stuff. That was something new to me. I never really thought about that. I always thought of Hollywood as they're just putting out entertainment. Sometimes they might be saying something, but I didn't really
Oh no!
delve deeper
Right.
into like, oh, this is how it actually shows
Yeah.
how culture changes over time and stuff like that.
You're mentioning that, and it's really interesting how my students are very attuned to how black and white the first movie is, the evil empire, the good rebels, and all of that. But now, then they get introduced to Saw Gerrera. Then they watch Rogue One.
Or Andor.
Um, then they well, we haven't I haven't been able to insert Andor into the class, but they start watching all of these things where things are infinitely more complex, and they're really attuned to how Star Wars began, and then how it developed.
Yeah.
And so it's been a really interesting conversation because the there's this really there's a running line about Star Wars that Star Wars is about good and evil. And I'm not saying it is not, but it gets trickier and trickier to decide what is good and what is evil, because the shows and the comics and the novels are constantly complicating things. I always recommend reading Lost Stars. They need to write one paper on a novel that they select, and I sort of give them about 15 novels, both legends and canon, and a lot of them choose Lost Stars, and it's a long book. It's a long book, but they read it and they're like, "Whoa, this is like taking the original trilogy and running with it in a way that the original trilogy does not." And so I love that they see how Star Wars is not static in the way that it tells a story, in the way that it develops characters, in the way that it depicts characters. Talking about the rebellion as they're all good is a little tricky when you watch Andor.
Exactly.
And when you meet Saw Gerrera. And so it's quite a treat to see the wheels turning in class, sort of like, wait a minute, we're not in the good versus evil anymore.
Well, that's
so that's fun. That's really quite fun.
Favorite panels I attended at DragonCon ever was actually last year, and it's basically about war crimes in Star Wars, and it was basically them talking about stuff on various sides. Like, is this action by the Rebel Alliance? Like, is them attacking the second Death Star? Would that be considered a war crime and stuff like that? And the person that's leading the panel is actually somebody that served in the U.S. military, and now he's an attorney, and part of his thing is actually advising the U.S. military on crimes and stuff like that. So he's taking from a real world perspective, like, our perspective, this would be a war crime. This wouldn't be a war crime. And it's very, because again, it goes on that thing, just because you're the rebels doesn't make everything you do good. You're a bad rebel. And same way, just because you're an empire, like, as I know you cosplay as Thrawn, you'll see a lot of art back here. Part of Thrawn's appeal is like, oh, he's a different type of Imperial. Obviously he has his bad elements, but he's also kind of presented as like the good Imperial in a lot of ways.
I mean, one of the things that I love,
one of the reasons I enjoyed it so much is, like, you come off watching the original movies and it's just like everybody's like Darth Vader, and then you go like, oh, this is a different type of him. This is interesting. I want to know more about this. What's this person's motivation and stuff like that.
Very true. Very true. It's one of the things why I love the new trilogies of Thrawn, because he's not a simple villain, like he is in Rebels, or even like he is in the original trilogy of the 90s. He's the arch enemy. He really is the arch enemy. But in the newer trilogies, he's not not at all, not at all. And the author Timothy Zahn has talked about, I don't see him as a bad character. So it's really interesting to have that happen in Star Wars. It happens in other franchises as well.
Oh yeah.
I mean, Star Trek has Deep Space Nine, and Deep Space Nine is that moment when Star Trek, to me, gets fascinating, just from really good to fascinating. So it's not unique to Star Wars, but it's really a treat to see it happen in Star Wars.
Sure. Well, I don't want to keep you forever, and we could probably talk about this forever, but one thing I did want to bring up, because I know during one of our conversations on one of our live streams, you brought out that you were very passionate about getting this book into libraries. Could you maybe talk about that a little bit, and maybe if people would like to get into their local library, how they can do that?
Yeah, I'm very aware that there are lots of people who are interested in reading but cannot afford books. And especially if you live in small towns, this is a book published by a university press. So there are many bookstores that cannot carry it because they need to have a contract with a series of university presses for them to carry it. So the best solution for this is for you guys to go to your local public library and say, could you purchase a copy of this book? And that way the book is available for your entire community. It can be checked out. It's available. There's some public libraries that now have electronic copies of books, and there is an ebook version of this book. So if it's easier for your library to do it that way, that would be another way. And it's just a matter of not downloading it, but sort of having access to the book to read it while you're checking it out. And it's been really nice to have the possibility. Lots of people have sent me like pictures of my book in like the Kansas City Public Library and in other places. Sort of like, it's there. They actually like listened to me and they bought the book. So it's really nice. I love, to me, accessibility is incredibly important. And I have the money to afford a book, but not everybody does. And I want everybody who wants to read a book to be able to have access to it. But a book like this is not something that libraries are constantly being bombarded with. And so if you guys are interested in having this book in your public library, I think that's the best way of doing it. Just do a book request and they will purchase the book. The book is not expensive; it's under $20. So in the budget of a public library, that is not a lot. And so that's what I would suggest. And get the soft cover, because the hardcover, the library edition, is like $90. Like nobody can buy that. I have one copy that they gave me because I'm the author, but that's it. So I would suggest that I'm happy for you if you want to buy it, but if you, I think it would be really a fun act of activism to also request for your public library to do it, so others can read it as well.
Yeah, and we said that. I honestly had never really thought about Star Wars books and libraries before. I'm a big supporter of libraries as a little kid. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up in a rural area, so the closest library for me was about a 30-minute drive. So how I read in school was, at that time they had a bookmobile program where they would literally load up a van full of books, and they would kind of drive it out and like, all right, for the kids that live within 10 miles of this area, we'll park here one day during the week during the summer, and you come get up. And that's how I read during the summer. But they never had Star Wars books there. Honestly, never really thought about it. But as a little kid, I would have been blown away if I'd have went in that bookmobile and go like, "Oh, there's a Star Wars book here. That's amazing!" So that's very cool. I'm definitely going to talk to my local library about that. I'm actually a volunteer with a local Friends of the Library program. So that's cool. And a lot of times, if I do have extra copies of the book, I'll donate it to them for their book sales and stuff like that as a way to like, hey, maybe these people don't know there's a Star Wars book and they'll discover it that way. But you did mention, in case
thank you for asking that question, because it's a really important thing for people to do. I think adding things to the library is a good way of sort of exposing other people for other things.
Exactly, yeah. Now, you did mention if somebody wants to buy it, and obviously I bought a copy. Where can people buy this book?
You can buy it online. I mean, places like Amazon and Barnes & Noble has it. You can also go to the Rutgers University Press website. And many times they have sales. This is part of a series called Quick Takes Movies in Popular Culture. And so they're all about the same size. They're all about sort of topics and movies and culture. And so many times they have like 30% off, 40% off. And so check their website, because you can get it a little cheaper that way. It doesn't take that long for them to ship it. If you want an ebook, it happens pretty much immediately. You buy the book and then they send you an email and you download the version that you ordered. But it is available online. It is readily available online, and it keeps selling. And let me tell you, you do not make money. I have royalties, but I look at those reports and I'm like, really? The press keeps most of the money. So when you're a bestseller, then you can negotiate. But
oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah.
I'm not a bestseller.
I'll post at least the Amazon link below. So if you need help finding the book and stuff like that, I'll share it there. But obviously, there's various ways to get it.
And you can find me on Instagram. I am also on Facebook, so you can send me a message to Messenger if you have questions or you just want to chat about Star Wars, I'm always happy to chat about Star Wars. So
Yeah, and I did want to give you a chance to maybe plug you and Nick's project
yes,
lunch. Maybe talk about like where they can find you that, and what y'all been talking about lately in your latest season.
we are. The show is called Nick and Mello's Hyperspace. Nick and I met online on a Star Wars Rebels Facebook group, and he's the one who said, "Let's do a podcast." And I had never thought about it, but I thought it was a really neat idea. He is in his late 20s. I am in my late 50s. He's straight. I'm gay. He's American from the South. I'm Puerto Rican. So I thought it would be really nice to have this sort of like very different people
Yeah, yeah.
talking to each other about Star Wars. It is not, we do reviews of shows and books and things like that, but we focus our seasons in topics or character studies. Like in the last season, we did a show called When Star Wars Makes Us Cry. And so all of the sort of notions about the emotion and tears and all of that. We had a whole episode on happy endings and the notion of hope. We're starting to recording for next season, and we're doing a whole show on droids because we just got to talk about droids, and then we want to focus on many of the new droids that have been showing up in Andor and Kenobi and all of that, because they're adding some really interesting things to it. Droids that don't speak, for example, in Kenobi, and so we do mostly topics. We love doing 9 episodes for the 9 movies of the Skywalker saga per season, but then we have other shows that we sort of do around when we are reviewing things. Like we're going to be recording a one on Mandalorian season 3, and we're doing a little one for Star Wars Day, and so we like doing little things like that. We're on YouTube, we're on Spotify, and actually we just had conversations with a podcast producer here in Chicago.
Oh wow.
To sort of beef up the technology, because this is very low tech.
Yeah.
And maybe get into like Apple Podcasts and all of that, and do a little bit of technology change with sound. So we're excited. We're excited. He was actually in my Star Wars class.
Oh wow.
And he was really angry that I already had a podcast, because he was going to suggest doing a podcast with him. Sort of like, what do you mean you have a podcast already? So we had a great conversation about possibilities and moving forward and all of that. So
Very cool.
it's been
Awesome.
fun. It's been fun.
Yeah, I know. I enjoyed a lot of y'all's videos. So I would say if you enjoy my channel, you'll probably enjoy theirs a lot. They get a lot
Awesome.
more topic specific than I do, but it's a very fun discussion a lot of times. And you know, again, some topics that you normally don't see explored sometimes on Star Wars and YouTube and stuff. So I definitely
And,
encourage
and I have the attention span of a baby, so they're short.
you.
We do about half an hour, sometimes 35 minutes, sometimes 25 minutes.
Yeah.
We did a really fun one about who is the mascot in Star Wars. It was just really fun, just sort of like this. It's a silly conversation, but it's a really interesting conversation about, Pikachu is the mascot of
Yeah.
Pokemon. Like where do we find that guy in Star Wars? So it's fun. It's really fun. It's really fun.
I would say at the moment, I think Grogu might be the mascot based on all my
Yeah,
Star
probably
Wars.
right now.
That's the thing
Yeah.
you identify the most with Star Wars is Grogu, or as my non-Star Wars fans still call him, Baby Yoda, because they don't know there's a difference. Yeah. Well, Carmelo, thanks for joining me. I know you have a very busy schedule, everything going on, but I really enjoyed this discussion. And again, get this book or get your library to carry it. Like if you're a Star Wars
Yes.
fan, you'll really enjoy this. So, as always, if you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. Also, check out Carmelo and Nick's channel. It's amazing. Check out the book. Do you have anything to add before we sign off?
I just wanted to thank you very much for doing this. It's so much fun to talk about my book, and it's so much fun to sort of spread the word about the book, because I think it's really interesting. I know I wrote it, but I think it's really, really fun and interesting. So
Well, I agree
thank you
with
so
your
much, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. See everybody the next time, and may the force be with you.
May the force be with you.